Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland.
Thank you and welcome to another episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. Now, before we continue with what I had planned for this episode, I'd like to briefly give my own salutations to all medical personnel working on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as all grocery store workers across the country who risk infection to provide an essential service. Also worthy of mention are the delivery truck drivers who make sure that we still receive our packages even in spite of the quarantine, as they too also take the risk of bringing this potentially deadly virus home to their families. In dark times like this, you are some of the true troopers that this country possesses, and as such, only an idiot would fail to recognize that you are some of the bravest people this world has ever seen. If no one else is grateful for what you do, please know that I am. So, that said, as of releasing this episode, the Southeast Utah Health Department has issued an April 1st public health order requiring that all salons, haircut, massage, and personal care businesses be shut down in an effort to flatten the curve of the COVID-19 spread. It's not impossible to imagine that entertainment businesses such as my town's only movie theater having also been shut down in an effort to flatten the same curve. In Grand County, recent restrictions on hotels were loosened to allow people intent on staying one night for emergency or fatigue reasons, with the emergency reasons clause coming under the advice of the county attorneys in Grand, Emery, and Carbon counties. While a mandatory stay-at-home order has not yet been placed in Utah, the restrictions on restaurants, closures of schools, and shutting down of non-essential businesses such as repair shops and beauty salons have certainly done a number in persuading most locals to stay at or around their homes. I can only conclude that this is an effort to avoid mandating a stay-at-home order and let the people decide to do so on their own, but only time will tell. At my weekend recovery clinic job, my employers prepared for a mandatory stay-at-home shelter by providing myself and the other employee here with approved letters which allow us to travel to our shifts should we be stopped by police either to or from work when a mandatory stay-at-home order is enacted. As long as I carry the letter and my new cloth weave mask on the days I work, I have no reason to believe I wouldn't be fine to go to the site if a mandatory order came down. As a majority, we've also begun to follow the newly established recommendation by the CDC that we wear protective cloth masks that we can attain, maintain, wear regularly, and clean easily. I have my own, thanks to the weekend job, and my coworker/superior is looking into attaining a set of scrubs for me that I can wear on the job just as he does. At this time, the governor has issued no further amendments to his orders to restore the life we knew by May 1st, and so that remains the current return date. However, because I'm employed at my local school district, the Grand County Superintendent will be in touch with me and all the other staff via email in case that does change. I should also make it clear that I have no intention of reporting anything on the national level, as there are enough sources on that job as it is, hence the local news reports. However, should you need national or international news you can trust, I highly recommend following the CDC updates through Facebook and other social media. You can also subscribe to the World Health Organization on any platform you use, and or follow Worldometers for accurate number information. Worldometers does a terrific job of not only recording total cases based on the data we have, but even recording the number of people who have recovered from COVID-19 worldwide, died, as well as covering what cases are closed and what ones are active. They even break it down further to allow you knowledge of the numbers every nation is currently reporting. One tip about this: don't check daily. At most, check every other day and check no less than once every week if you use this platform or any other reporting platform of this nature, as daily check-ins can make the numbers get confusing after a time. So, with all this said, let's briefly recap what we covered on the pilot episode of this show. We started with a news coverage much like today's in nature, briefly defined autism spectrum disorder for the unfamiliar, introduced and defined the autistic savant, and came up with some suggestions for things parents of an autistic savant can do in order to alleviate some of their stresses. Lastly, we covered savant-style or savant-like talents in high-functioning autistic children, and came up with ways parents could use those talents to alleviate some of their troubles in this unprecedented time. Last but not least, we also answered questions that you, the audience, had for me. Now, again, for anyone watching at home that might be unfamiliar as to autism spectrum disorder, it's an umbrella term for a group of disorders characterized by difficulties or inabilities in social interaction and communication, with extreme cases resulting in an inability to adapt and change routines, the theme of today's episode, by the way. So, amongst our suggestions in last week's episode for parents of high functioning autistic children with a savant like talent, quote unquote, was making a final project that they can then present to the family. Whether this is a politically inclined child learning how to draft a bill that they present before a quote unquote council, or a chemically inclined child who attempts to demonstrate a new line of natural soap, this is designed to help increase their social abilities and teach them vital communication skills that they will need when this crisis is over. Last time I also mentioned making a social contract where as long as the child is caught up on schoolwork, satisfies physical needs like hunger or hygiene, they're allowed to let their powers of cognitive dissonance take over and truly apply themselves to their savant or savant-like talent. There is one other thing I should add on to this before I continue with my next point. Even high-functioning autistic people can have trouble adjusting to changes in routine and quote-unquote going with the flow, as you and I might. For myself, I solve this by establishing with fellow employees, friends, family, and employers that if there was a way they could give me 24 to 48 hour notice on anything important, I'd be fine. The exception to this rule would be unexpected emergencies such as the initial lockdown, or things of that nature that don't conform to your time schedule and are quite understandable. However, in the movie Rain Man, to which we referred in the last show, extreme cases can result in such rigidity that the person in question cannot account for the possibility of anyone they're meeting being even 1 minute late for any meeting they have with the autistic person in question. It wouldn't surprise me if there's at least one parent who's attempted to explain the COVID-19 changes in routine to their severely autistic children and have had to calm the tide of rage that followed hearing about these changes. Or, if not having one large explosive tantrum before settling down, maybe becoming continuously aggressive and hostile, perhaps even stimming more frequently than usual. Now bear in mind that what I'm about to say hasn't been verified by the experts, so I can't confirm it. Even so, I don't have my doubts that they've seen what I'm talking about in their own work and would arrive to a similar conclusion if asked. But I believe that the reason that autistic children and impaired adults who face these disruptions act out in tantrums and or stimming more, as someone who used to hate even the slightest changes when he was a child, is because not only do they feel like their world has been turned upside down, which in this case is extremely accurate, but after the tantrum they learn that if they can't control how much they're used to going out, then they can at least control how much they do something such as stimming. When they learn they can control that, it's not impossible to imagine them becoming more cooperative with time. The summary of this being that it's an issue of control and perhaps an underlying belief that their parent, guardian, or other caregiver had been in complete control of their routine up until this point. Considering that this is true more often than it isn't, it's not an inaccurate observation on their part. As such, parents without a backup routine that they've gone over with their children can find themselves in a load of trouble when the primary one is out for the count. This is keeping in mind that as a high-functioning autistic adult, I'd like to say that I've adapted pretty well, but even I will tell you there were moments when I almost shut down as well during the first couple of weeks this was happening. In my case, however, there's an easy explanation that I can provide. It was an issue of nearly feeling like I'd lost my sense of purpose, which only happened one other time, after I graduated college. Heck, I'd be the first to tell you that in light of what my social development project with Beacon After School was supposed to entail at the secondary education level, it was easy during the first 2 weeks to feel like I failed. To feel like I had put so much energy into what could have been a landmark in after-school education here in Utah for nothing. But I fought past that, worked housekeeping at the hospital for those critical 2 weeks, reminded myself that none of this was my fault as constantly as possible, and came up with this show in the process. For no financial gain so much as the hope that I can continue to make a difference as a trained educator on the autism spectrum, I might add. But not too many are that fortunate, and that brings me to one element of the social contract idea that I mentioned last time, an element that we'll go over and discuss after this break. Thank you. Thank you for tuning back into Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. Before the break, we recapped the core concepts in the pilot, talked about how changes in routine as related to COVID-19 may have caused meltdowns on the home front. We also reiterated the importance of a social contract being in place should parents decide to use their child's savant or savant-like talent to help provide some of the entertainment for the rest of the family, as well as increase their child's social skills. So with that, there is something with that social contract you can do to reestablish a sense of routine even further. Assign times at which they can be allowed to work on their savant project. Now what this entails is assigning precise beginning and end times to all activities that are either planned or at least common in the household. Now, a sample routine can be that the child wakes up at 8 in the morning to have breakfast and has to be done by 9. Then they start online school at whatever time is assigned their first class, such as 10 a.m. or something of that nature. And they work at their classes until whatever time all classes are done. If they have homework for school, then they must work at that from the time class ends to no less than 2 hours after. Isolate a good time for lunch, especially if it's in between classes, then come up with a time for dinner based on homework, classes, and breakfast. If there is time left after dinner, they can then work on their savant talent project as long as their homework and tests don't come back as failed and as long as they're in bed by no later than whatever time you dictate. Make an exception for if they get sick or something similarly severe happens as needed and include that in the contract if you think that's the only way either of you will remember. Now, you might also want to put a term in the contract that says that this routine will end when the quarantine does, so that they have some knowledge that the routine will again change before it does. But besides this, remember one thing. If you decide to do this, bend the routine as little as possible until it's established as an ulterior activity to the pre-quarantine life they knew. When we return from the quarantine, you might also want to consider not only keeping this quarantine routine handy, but perhaps comprising one or two other alternative routines that you can adapt to your child's norm as situations arise. An example of this would be maybe calling this quarantine social contract code lockdown to indicate that we're under another lockdown and this alternate routine is in effect. Please understand, however, that I am more than aware of how some parents of autistic children might work too many hours to possibly plan any such routines. Even in the pre-quarantine economy, I can't tell you how many times I heard of people working 2 or 3 jobs in my hometown to put food on the table for even non-autistic children, much less a routine-oriented autistic child. If this is the case with you, but it turns out you have a trusted older child who's not autistic or a reliable relative who can do this for you, come up with a rough idea of what each plan is meant to entail and see what they can whip up. Remember, this quarantine and the aftermath will not only be a time of testing for you, it'll be a chance for the ingenuity of any other children you have to shine through in caring for their autistic sibling while you continue to work, presuming you can. Should your child not be overfond of going on summer vacation due to a love of school and its consistency, speaking as someone who loved that, and as does tend to happen in routine-minded autistic children, maybe come up with a routine you call Code Summer, which is enacted on the very last day of school. A routine called Code Graduation for when they inevitably graduate high school or age out of services might also be a good idea. As long as the child or severely impaired adult understands the idea of shifting from one routine to another, the ability to transition and adapt will eventually come naturally to them. The most important principle of checking understanding of transition and contingencies is this. Have plans that you don't need right now, but you can call upon them at a moment's notice. so that your child or impaired adult doesn't feel like they've lost that control or lost their faith in your ability to control the changes that occur. This also takes stress off you in ensuring that they can adjust to situations like this in the long term. The whole point of these plans concerning themselves with the big picture. It will especially prove true if you have non-autistic children or other caregivers who can collaborate with you in making sure this adaptability is learned. Remember, a short-term extra mile in routine planning now ensures long-term flexibility and adaptability for your child later. At my weekend job, we do something similar with our recovery clientele. There, the courts establish that, if selected for testing, they have to arrive to the testing facility by no later than an established time and have to produce a viable test sample by no later than another, later established time. Should they fail to adhere to this for any reason, it counts the same as testing positive for a substance and they serve some jail time for that. In extreme cases, such as deliberate non-compliance, it's happened once or twice that a client's treatment was temporarily put on hold while they served more substantial jail time. I bring this up because it means that if there's traction with setting established times and consequences with non-autistic people recovering from addiction, it can most certainly hold water with your routine-minded autistic child. I've even had to explain to a couple of my clients who brought up a need for routine that I'm autistic and can usually feel the heat of a changed routine every bit as bad as or worse than they can through no other reason than how my brain is wired in general. And that was for consolation purposes, which allowed me to maintain control of the situation in the testing environment without becoming excessive in my means. And remember, I'm just the guy who helps male clients produce a viable sample for the courts. I'm not trained to handle their recovery in any other way. Not as a therapist, not as a police officer, though we test technicians do collaborate with law enforcement as needed. Nothing. With this said, we'll come to the conclusion of this segment and go on to questions from home after this next break. Thank you. Welcome back to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. Once again, I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. So last time we reiterated the importance of a social contract with a routine-minded autistic child. After that first segment, we then discussed potential ways to not only survive this crisis but also thrive in returning to normal, including the idea of not only keeping the quarantine plan handy in the future, but also composing a minimum of 2 other plans for other situations. Now we are on our next segment called Questions from Home. From my hometown of Moab, Utah, Daniel asks the following. Dear Chris, can you talk about how disruption of routine might feel for some autistic youth during this unprecedented time? Well, I'm glad you asked that, as this was the question which influenced the theme of today's episode. However, before I answer this question, I should point out something for the audience that will bear relevance in answering this question. Daniel is the head of the school district mentoring program here in Moab. It was with him that I applied to become a mentor during the school day whilst I waited for my after-school job to begin, whether this was early mornings at HMK on the days I would head to the middle school, or early afternoons when I'd head over to the elementary school. He was also the gentleman who cleared me to work with my first 2 mentees who were in the middle and high schools. His second in command would be later responsible for helping set up my third mentoring partnership at the elementary school once Daniel had processed the relevant application and cleared it. This is in addition to the kids I work with at Beacon after school, keeping in mind that I am one of the only educators in my district who can brag about working with grades 1 through 9 at minimum in 1 week. With that all said, long answer, well, I know from my own experience that had this happened when I was in high school, I'd have probably needed to be quarantined anyway for my own safety, or at least I would be more likely to need that than I am now. However, for other autistic children, it might not be the same story. One autistic kid I worked with as a mentor before this crisis hit has said to me that he only disapproves of the fact that he can't really enjoy basketball or see his friends as he once did but beyond that, has adjusted fairly well. Another autistic child I mentored has appreciated the fact that his schoolwork is usually quickly done and leaves him more time to do the things he likes to do inside the house. With my third and eldest one, I've yet to know the full extent of his adjustment to this time of crisis, but I have no reason to believe it isn't largely positive. However, some feelings I can describe other autistic children potentially feeling. Well, as an autistic adult, I can tell you I certainly felt a sense of loss. At times, I felt guilt for what I was unable to achieve in my social development after school project before this happened. I wondered where I could possibly go from, knowing that I couldn't go to the one thing I have probably loved more than any other job I've ever worked in my life. There was knowing I wouldn't be able to check on all the kids with whom I worked before this crisis hit. And that's what really put me in some red light, even as I knew I was making somewhat of a difference in my hospital housekeeping job before I left. Even while I was working it, I was reminded of my post-graduation days where I felt lost, confused, even alone. Though I did overcome it in creating this show, at least for now. Others who have more severe cases, however, might feel like they've lost everything that they ever knew, and lost everything they loved to begin with. Or so close to that, the difference is irrelevant. I wouldn't be surprised if there are nonverbal autistic people who'd tell you they feel like they're to blame somehow if they have the words to tell you or their parents. Like maybe this is somehow related to something they've done, as I had been tempted to feel when the first orders came down. Maybe some might feel like they did a really bad thing, and that's why their routine had fallen apart. Or, as was also the case with me, and I wager is the case with some high-functioning autistic people who lost their jobs because of this, maybe they're looking back on the summary of their lives and wondering if this quarantine means they've done anything worthy of appreciation if they were gone tomorrow. All I can say in response to this is that beyond establishing alternate routines for parents, all we can do is either insist with our autistic children that it isn't their fault, give those more capable of understanding what's going on the assurance that none of this is their doing. If you're a parent, hold them close when they're down and keep reminding them that as much or as little as you need. If you're a teacher, paraprofessional, or other educator who's worked with autistic children as I have, maybe check in on them once in a while when you can. Let them know that they're not forgotten, that they don't have to worry about being kicked to the curb and left to fend for themselves along with their families because of the pandemic. Heck, if you're a history teacher checking in on an autistic student who has similar strengths to you, maybe even practice drawing comparisons of the severity of COVID-19 versus the severity of the Black Death for kicks, for goofs, for whatever. Whatever they need. Autistic children are certainly like non-autistic kids in one regard when it comes to crisis. The feeling that there are still people who care in their lives, family included, will go a long way to helping them come out okay on the other side. Lord knows that I'm not a kid, but I'm certainly looking forward to the day when I'll see my students and my mentees again. I look forward to seeing their smiling faces. I look forward to hearing them laugh. I look forward to hosting activities for them. I look forward to everything I ever loved about my after-school job and more. Now, this is also one way in which we are the same, as I'm sure there's no shortage of people who feel as I do that aren't autistic, that maybe have children to feed but can't go back to work because their job is one of the non-essential businesses and maybe there isn't an online avenue they can work instead. For people in that boat, I wouldn't be surprised if there are those who feel abandoned by their government because of a perceived lack of coordinated response, and doubly so if they're the target audience of this program and have a child with a severe case. But there is a silver lining of all this, that it's not forever, and in my case, I've certainly been reminded of late of the Greek mythological story of Pandora's box. And I'll explain why. In the story, the Titan Prometheus has been punished for his offenses against the gods of Olympus, and the first woman, named Pandora, has been created. The seed of insatiable curiosity has been planted within her, and she's been given orders to not open the infamous box, no matter how curious she becomes. This is keeping in mind that the gods knew she would fail at this, and inevitably she does. She accidentally releases the evils of the Greek pantheon like gossip, murder, greed, hubris, and countless others. Virtues like trust and restraint are also released from the box, perhaps symbolizing a time of mistrust and unbridled appetites in the world for which this story was written. But she closes the lid just in time to keep one tiny little moth-like entity inside, so small and so insignificant to look at. But it's perhaps the greatest of all. Locked within Pandora's box is the gift of hope, which must never be allowed to flutter away. So this is a message to all those people that feel that way, and that you haven't been abandoned, you haven't been forgotten, and you haven't been ignored. Not by me, at least. Just don't let the hope within you flutter away as you hear the news about this crisis. And with that, we will go to the conclusion of this next installment after the break. Thank you for tuning back into Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. In our last two segments, we spoke about establishing a binding social contract whereby an autistic child in need of a routine might be persuaded to honor the terms in exchange for a unified household. We included the possibility of setting time-based boundaries for working on a project related to the child's savant or savant-like talent, as well as discuss the need for consistency in this routine in order to establish it. We also established the need to consider the possibility of not only keeping it as a contingency against future quarantines, but also establishing other plans that can be enacted based around the closure or termination of school services for any significant reason, such as graduation or vacation. We also answered a question that influenced the theme of this episode, and I delved into a little bit of how I felt as a result of this crisis, as well as provided some clarity as to how some autistic youth might be feeling, as well as sharing with you what my mentees have had to say about this crisis, as well as any other students I might have been able to keep in contact with over the several weeks that we have been out for the count, except in virtual reality. I also wanted to say that recently a very cheerful event happened that I ought to tell you. I was walking down to the grocery store, and as I did so, a couple of parents that knew me and a first grader that had loved my after-school clubs had the window rolled down. She waves at me and she says hello with this really perky little smile that's just fantastic to see and really helps me get through my day. This is, of course, keeping in mind that I was celebrating the achievement of the pilot last Friday when this happened, and kind of planning what this next episode would be about. And I gotta tell you, that's going to be one for the books. That's going to be one that I'm going to remember long after this quarantine is over. That's going to be one that I'm going to remember long after things have gone back to normal, and that's one thing that really certainly helped me, at least, know that I made a difference in someone's life. And I hope that my fellow after-school teachers, school day teachers, paraprofessionals, etc., can all say they have at least one experience in relation to this quarantine where they know they made an impact on the kids. Now, I wanted to wrap up things by saying that if you have any questions that you would like to have answered in the next segment that maybe you think could influence the theme of the next episode itself, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have me on Messenger, or to fill out the document form that I'll be providing in the description of the video when it's published, and or emailing me if that's the only channel you have too. Please bear in mind that I'll try to answer as many questions as I can, or if there's one that I feel I can't answer quite as well, I'll forward you to an expert that I believe can. Hence my usual disclaimers that my tips and suggestions are no substitution for the professional opinions of people who have master's degrees, PhDs, etc. in autism work. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys so much for the support, the appreciation, the love for the pilot. It means the world that you guys enjoy this. And remember, I'm only doing this because you guys want it and because I care enough about Autism Awareness Month to acknowledge it even in this time of quarantine. And I hope someone out there who is watching this that they've not let their hope flutter away. Or if they have, that they had some hope reignited within them after watching this episode. Thanks again to our medical personnel for fighting on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks to our grocery store workers for risking their lives every day. And thank you to people working at companies like Amazon who also risk their lives in continuing to deliver products to our doorstep, even though most of the country is officially quarantined. You are all some of the bravest people that we could ever ask for, and I can only hope to someday have half the courage that you guys did. This has been Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland, and I will see you guys next time. Produced, written, narrated, starring, edited, and directed by Christopher Cleveland. In addition to the medical personnel fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and the grocery store workers who continue to provide an ever-essential service, this episode is dedicated to Grand Area Mentoring, the school district mentoring program, and all the mentors who have chosen to keep in touch with their mentees in this unusual time. In this program, a mentor is usually paired with a promising student for an hour per week. The difference that Grand Area Mentoring has made within these constraints is beyond astonishing, and has positively turned around too many lives to easily count. I'm proud to be a mentor myself through this program and look forward to returning to the way it was when the quarantine is past. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.